Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to dive right into one of the most controversial, heavily debated, and frankly misunderstood conflicts of the entire 20th century. The legacy of the Vietnam War still shapes foreign policy and public trust even today. But to truly grasp it, we really have to look past the old slogans and the simplified narratives. So, what really happened in Vietnam? To understand this conflict, I'm going to ask you to just completely forget the simple version of history you might have been taught. If you think this was just a war that suddenly kicked off the moment American troops set foot on the ground, or that it was a straightforward good versus evil battle between two neat ideologies, you're missing the much, much bigger picture. Think about the sheer scale of this for a second. It is absolutely staggering. We're talking about a conflict that dragged on for nearly 2 decades. The United States sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers thousands of miles away from home. And get this, it's a mind-blowing fact. The U.S. dropped more bombs in some theaters of this war than were used during the entirety of World War II. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. And yet, despite all of that overwhelming, unprecedented American military might, the United States still failed to achieve its central objective, and the enemy ultimately took the capital. So how does that even happen?
Well, it's easy to picture this conflict as simply America versus Vietnam, right? A neat binary fight of capitalism versus communism. But honestly, that's a myth. The reality was a totally messy, complex collision of decolonization, fierce Vietnamese nationalism, global Cold War paranoia, and a deeply rooted civil struggle over who would actually control the country's future. Okay, let's start with part 1, colonial roots and division.
You know, for decades, Vietnam was actually part of the French colonial empire. Then, during World War II, Japan occupied the region, and a resistance movement started to grow, led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh was a dedicated communist, absolutely, but he was also a fierce Vietnamese nationalist. And surprisingly, when he declared independence back in 1945, he actually modeled his speech directly on the American Declaration of Independence, hoping to get U.S. support. But France wanted its colony back. This sparked the First Indochina War, which ended in a massive, crushing French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The result? Vietnam was temporarily split right at the 17th parallel. You had Ho Chi Minh's communists up in the north and an anti-communist state down in the south. They were supposed to have nationwide elections to reunify the country, but they never happened.
Which brings us to part 2, the American escalation.
American policymakers at the time were completely driven by the Domino Theory. In the super paranoid context of the Cold War, the U.S. was terrified that if Vietnam became communist, all the surrounding countries in Southeast Asia would just topple one by one, exactly like a row of dominoes. So, to stop this, the U.S. started heavily supporting South Vietnam. Initially, it was just military advisors, money, and weapons, but the South Vietnamese government was really struggling with severe corruption and internal instability. Meanwhile, the communist opposition, including the Viet Cong, was just growing stronger and stronger. And then comes 1964. Everything changed. In August of that year, reported attacks on American naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin fundamentally shifted the entire U.S. approach. Now, the exact details of those attacks became incredibly controversial later on, but the immediate political fallout, it was enormous. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which effectively handed President Lyndon B. Johnson broad, sweeping authority to dramatically expand American military operations, and he didn't even need a formal declaration of war to do it. By 1965, American combat troops were deploying in massive, massive numbers. So here is the crucial issue. There was a profound mismatch in strategies. The basic American strategy relied heavily on overwhelming, superior conventional firepower. We're talking tanks, advanced aircraft, and enormous bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder. But the Vietnamese battlefield, it was a completely different world. Try bringing tanks into dense jungles, steep mountains, and flooded rice fields. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces adapted brilliantly. They utilized elaborate tunnel systems, hidden bases, and brutal guerrilla warfare. So American military superiority was constantly being undermined by an enemy that simply refused to fight by traditional conventional rules. American troops could win a specific firefight, but they'd still struggle to achieve any sort of decisive political victory. Which leads us to a pretty grim question. On a battlefield like that, how do you actually measure success? They couldn't measure it by territory captured, so American commanders often pointed to enemy casualties, the infamous body counts. The logic was basically a math problem. If we kill more of their soldiers and they kill of ours, we must be winning. But Vietnam was not a math problem. The U.S. could wipe out enemy units and launch massive bombing runs all day long.
But as long as the political opposition retained the will to recruit and keep fighting, the war just kept going.
Let's move to part 3, the turning point.
1968. This is the year that literally shattered American expectations. Out of nowhere, communist forces launched the Tet Offensive. It was this massive, highly coordinated series of surprise attacks across all of South Vietnam. They hit cities, they hit military bases, and incredibly, they even breached the American embassy compound in Saigon. Now, if you look at it strictly militarily, the communist forces actually suffered enormous, devastating losses during Tet. But politically, it was a masterstroke. It was a massive turning point that completely shocked viewers watching the evening news back home in the United States.
People watching this unfold began asking themselves, wait, if the enemy could launch such a massive, coordinated offensive, how close was victory, really? For years, the American public had been told by their government that the U.S. was winning, that the light was at the end of the tunnel. But the imagery on their televisions completely contradicted those promises. They were literally watching the enemy attack the U.S. embassy. This massive credibility gap severely damaged the government's standing. It sparked a massive, society-dividing anti-war protests. You had students marching, returning veterans heavily criticizing the conflict, and everyday families totally torn apart, arguing over whether this war was even justified anymore. And as this conflict dragged on, the catastrophic costs just compounded. For the United States, over 58,000 service members died, with hundreds of thousands more wounded, leaving behind a deeply fractured society. But we also have to look at the unimaginable toll on Vietnamese civilians. Millions, literally millions, were killed, wounded, or displaced. They were tragically caught right in the middle of this escalating violence, which sadly included horrific events like the My Lai Massacre, where unarmed civilians were killed by American soldiers. And environmentally, the devastation was generational. The immense quantities of bombs, napalm, and chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, which were used to strip away the jungle cover, left scars on the land and the people that are still felt today.
This brings us to part 4, a complicated legacy.
So, President Richard Nixon tried a new strategy called Vietnamization, essentially withdrawing American ground forces while trying to bulk up the South Vietnamese military to fight on their own. During this time, the war actually expanded into neighboring Cambodia and Laos to target enemy supply routes. But after U.S. combat troops finally left in 1973 under the Paris Peace Accords, South Vietnam's position rapidly fell apart. In 1975, a major North Vietnamese offensive caused the southern defenses to totally collapse. And on April 30th, 1975, communist forces rolled right into Saigon. The defining image of this moment, broadcast all over the globe, became those helicopters desperately evacuating American personnel and their Vietnamese allies from rooftops. Those images, they represented a tragic defeat to some, a triumphant reunification to others, and just terrifying uncertainty for the civilians who were left behind.
But here's the thing. The end of the war absolutely did not mean the end of the suffering. It triggered a terrifying cascade of regional and global consequences. In a newly unified communist Vietnam, political repression meant former South Vietnamese officials and soldiers were packed off to harsh re-education camps. Hundreds of thousands of desperate refugees fled, often taking incredibly dangerous journeys by sea, becoming known to the world as the Boat People. The massive destabilization of the entire region also contributed to Cambodia descending into a catastrophic civil conflict and outright genocide under the Khmer Rouge. And back in America, events like the release of the Pentagon Papers, which proved definitively that officials had been misleading the public, led to a permanent decline in public trust and massive, long-lasting shifts in how the country approached foreign military intervention.
Look, there is just no single slogan that explains this war. It was the product of massive colliding forces and totally competing visions. To some, it was a tragic American mistake. To others, it was a necessary attempt to hold the line and contain communism. To the Vietnamese communists, it was a long, hard-fought struggle for national reunification, while the many South Vietnamese, it was a desperate fight against communist rule. And for the everyday civilians just caught in the middle, it was simply a total catastrophe. Ultimately, the side that was willing to absorb extraordinary, almost unthinkable losses and just keep fighting indefinitely achieved its political objective, while the United States found out it couldn't fight forever. Which leaves us with this final thought. The United States could destroy roads, level bases, and win just about every conventional firefight. But military power alone could not easily solve a political problem that was rooted so deeply in Vietnamese history. Nor could it just conjure a legitimate government out of thin air. Because weapons alone cannot secure political legitimacy, this explainer leaves us with a profound question about the true limits of overwhelming military power. What happens when a superpower actually discovers those limits?
It's a deeply complicated legacy, paid for by millions of ordinary people and shaped by decisions made far, far beyond the battlefield. Thanks for joining me as we unpacked the reality of the Vietnam War.